Truth is often a moving target, and the battle between misinformation, partial truths, and outright lies challenges democracies to decide between preserving freedom of speech and safeguarding the integrity of information.
Part of the challenge of responding to rogue actors who leverage disinformation is that we don't actually have a great sense of what's happening in our information ecosystem.
How are new technologies fueling the spread of misinformation worldwide? And how can democracies tackle the rising tide of online violence and propaganda? This is Global Insights by Network 2020. Today, propaganda and misinformation in the digital age. Joining us today is Chris Meserole and Kalev Lataru. Chris Meserole is a fellow at the Brookings Institution, known for his research on digital extremism and authoritarianism. Kalev Lataru is a media fellow at the Real Clear Foundation and a senior fellow at the George Washington University Center for Cyber and Homeland Security, who works in the realm of big data and its impact on society. He is also the founder of the GDELT Project, a constantly updated database that monitors news media worldwide. Moderating the discussion is Courtney Doggett, president of Network 2020.
So today we will have a very interesting conversation. As I've been reflecting recently, they say that history is written by the victors, but increasingly it also seems like it is being written by the algorithms. And at stake really are our human brains, which apparently now consume as much information in a day as a person did in a lifetime centuries ago. And even so, our consumption is limited to the vast amounts of information that is out there. So what we take in shapes our view of the world around us and trust in our societies. And as our former speaker and Nobel Prize winner, Maria Ressa said, when you don't have facts, truth, and trust, you don't have democracy. So what are the tools that individuals and governments can use to generate, distribute, and filter information? And how are those tools shaping the broader geopolitical environment? So we will be exploring all of those questions today. Chris, I'm going to start where I usually like to start, which is with a definition question. So what is it exactly that we're talking about when we use the term misinformation, just because its meaning seems to have different connotations depending on different contexts. And so I'd love for you just to define how you think about misinformation and how technology is enabling or enabling its production and distribution.
Yeah, well, first of all, just thank you for having me, and thank you for setting up this conversation. It's a real pleasure to be here, and an honor to be able to contribute to this forum. But as far as kind of the question about what misinformation is and what disinformation is, there's a lot of terms that have been used in this kind of political discourse around it. Fake news, deep fakes, misinformation. And I think the main point I would make as far as trying to wrap your head around what it actually is that we're talking about when we think about misinformation is that there's really two ways that you can inject inject into kind of the information environment or political discourse of society, the kind of information that can erode trust in that discourse. And that one way to do that is to take something that has a kernel of truth to it and just take it out of context and blow it up and amplify it or kind of reframe it in a way that's very misleading. And that is really what we mean when we think about misinformation, right? And a good example of this would be, a lot of the critiques that we saw of, say, like vaccines and kind of the misinformation that flooded out around the pandemic and vaccines, where you had folks saying, well, we know that some people who have gotten this vaccine have had like heart attacks, for example, and therefore we can't trust. And it's like, well, there is a truth there, right? Like if you vaccinate tens of millions of people, some of them are going to have heart attacks. But that doesn't mean that there's a causal relationship between the vaccine and that impact. And it certainly doesn't mean that vaccines are harmful. That's kind of where we need to kind of inject better science and science reporting into the conversation. But the idea of misinformation is really information that might have a piece of truth to it, but that is being used in a way that's very misleading for a particular kind of political outcome or agenda. That's different from what we might think of as disinformation, which is more where kind of fake news comes into play, where it's really information that's deliberately misleading and a falsehood. And there, a good example would be like, in its most outlandish form, again, to kind of use vaccines as an example here, the idea that like vaccines are injected with microchips that are then going to kind of, it's like the state control, the state's going to have control over people who get a vaccine because they've kind of put this new technology in there. Obviously that's false, but that's kind of what more traditionally disinformation has referred to as opposed to misinformation. They are both really problematic in that both of them undermine the trust that individuals have in the kind of integrity of the broader information ecosystem that they're a part of, and in the kind of information that they're hearing from political leaders. And I think to the point about how there's kind of being produced and disseminated now, I think one of the things that's different about misinformation and disinformation, both of which have really existed for centuries, really as long as politics has existed, the incentive to distort information has also existed. What's new is that we have these kind of smartphones in our pockets, and kind of all of us have laptops, and it's very easy now for us to create fake information, whether that's text or audio or video. On the one hand, it's very easy for us to create this kind of misinformation and disinformation. And on the other end, in some ways, even more importantly, it's very easy now, by virtue of the social networks and social media that have grown up over the last 10 or 15 years, and the sheer scale, the global scale that they've now reached, the algorithms that govern how information flows through those platforms have gotten really good at figuring out what kind of users are most responsive to. And most of the time, what they're most responsive to in many cases is like the most sensationalized content, which often is content that is maybe, just has had the truth fudged a little bit, or is outright false, right? And so misinformation and disinformation have always existed, but now they're actually really well positioned to actually perform extremely well in the information ecosystem that's emerged around social media, whether it's Facebook or Instagram or TikTok or Twitter. We now have ways, for those who are kind of interested in injecting misinformation and disinformation into the discourse, it's pretty straightforward to get some of these narratives, like very problematic, misleading narratives, whether it's about vaccines or politics, into the mainstream political discourse by virtue of just the sheer scale of these platforms and the way that algorithms have learned to disseminate them. So I'll stop there for now. There's a lot more I can kind of unpack, but that's kind of at a high level how I think about the issue now, and kind of why it's so problematic at the moment.
Great, thanks, Chris. Kalev, what about you? Do you have a similar take on the term? And you've been looking at a ton of data, and what does that tell you about the pervasiveness of misinformation circulating?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's absolutely fascinating. And thank you so much for having me here today. I think one of the greatest mistakes that we oftentimes make in this space is to oversimplify things, to say, well, there's kind of this misguided notion that there's right and wrong to every question. Certainly some questions, especially if they're of a factual nature, there is a right or wrong answer to that. But so much, we sort of have this idea oftentimes, especially in the technology world, that there's a right answer to every question. And our job as technologists and social platforms and the rest are to essentially silence those wrong answers. And there's a whole bunch of different interesting things with it. So one is, we've been rushing to build these tools that allow centralized control of narratives. But as we're seeing across the world, governments are now using those tools to their own political ends. There's so many examples across the world of even democratic governments using these ordering social platforms to, silence debate, anti-government criticism, protests, and other activities. And oftentimes the questions oftentimes the questions that are sort of central to the conversation, the ones that we want to either debunk or approve, are the ones that we don't know. So take the example of the 10-year-old with the abortion. I mean, even the fact checker stepped in, even the Washington Post fact checker stepped forward and said, we can't disprove this, but there's a lot of questions about this. We really, really have to be cautious about accepting this narrative. It even condemned its own paper of saying, look at all of our reporters just rushing off accepting this story. And there's real questions. And that in turn led to this whole narrative that, this just isn't real. This is a fake news. Look, even the Wash Post is debunked, which they didn't. They simply said there's a lot of questions here. But again, that's because, and of course, now we know the story was very, very real. And there was a lot of harm to that, the fact checkers kind of stepping in attempting to debunk that. And that's, again, the question that oftentimes fact checkers, we don't have those writers. People know, but oftentimes there's sort of those, whether it's social platforms or O's, they're not in the position to really be able to answer those questions. But worse, oftentimes this fight towards disinformation can suppress accurate information. So recall in the early days of the pandemic, the US government, public health authorities, Fauci, Surgeon General, all those stepped forward and said, do not wear a mask. There was a very famous CDC exchange. It was a media briefing. It was a CDC media briefing for American media. They said, look, we need your help. We're seeing increasing reports that people are starting to wear masks. Americans are attempting to wear masks because they're seeing in Europe people wear masks. We need your help to stop that. Do whatever you need to do, leverage the power of you as the media to stop Americans from wearing masks. And later on, I asked, a while later, a couple months after this, I asked Facebook and I said, you now have a policy that says if someone posts something that runs contrary to a current CDC guidance, that you'll take that down and ban that user. What would have happened if this policy had been in effect a few months ago? And let's say a major leading American doctor stepped forward on Facebook and said, I'm a public health authority. I strongly believe that we should be wearing masks. If you look in Europe, everyone's wearing masks. And their answer was, yes, under our policy, yes, we would have to remove that and probably ban that person for life. And that's a huge, huge problem. And it's a really interesting issue. And of course, you also had another famous example there with blood clots. So early on, the policies all banned mentions of blood clots associated with any of the vaccines. And so what you saw was a lot of people starting to step forward, and especially in certain demographics, saying, I experienced blood clots from this. And of course, you had the social media companies stepping in, removing all that information. And later on, that turns out that actually was a legitimate medical symptom for certain demographic groups. And then you had to all the platforms had to then alter those policies to say, well, now we're going to allow that. And there was a lot of interesting questions raised of what would happen in the early days if that policy had not been in effect. And we've been able as public health authorities to see, wow, there's something systematic here. But more importantly, disinformation is increasingly becoming shorthand for other political views. For the past year and a half, CNN, MSNBC, they really haven't talked about inflation. When sort of left or center kind of left media have talked about inflation, it was always contextualized as yet another right-wing conspiracy theory. And actually a number of outlets actually use the term disinformation to say that it's harmful falsehoods being propagated to harm the administration. Whereas Fox News and more right-leaning outlets were running a lot of coverage of inflation. And the reason wasn't that it was fake and it was false and a right-wing conspiracy theory and disinformation. It was two very different halves of America were experiencing rising costs very differently. The side of America that was sort of the CNN, MSNBC crowd, rising prices weren't really having an impact on. They were able to absorb it. It wasn't hurting them. For more of the Fox News viewership, rising prices were having a huge impact on their ability to live, their ability to afford food. And that's just one of many examples. But we see this increasingly now across the world. You see saying, well, anyone who disagrees with me, that's disinformation. And finally, and I will add as well that we're actually starting to see the weaponization of that. So in the case of Russia, for example, they're recognizing we don't have the power as the Russian state to truly censor information here. We don't have that control. So what we're going to do here is Russian media. It's amazing. If you watch Russian television, anything that's negative about the war, they're plastering it all over television, like Bucha, nonstop, wall-to-wall coverage. Many countries like China, it's censored. In Russia, it was wall-to-wall coverage with fake news, disinformation. And so that was a really interesting thing of saying, look, everyone's talking about this. So let's put this all out here and say, oh, it's all fake, it's all fake. And so that's something I think we need to think about is that, we like to say, hey, there's a right and wrong answer to everything. And certainly for some things there are, but oftentimes those are the ones like the 10-year-old abortion, like the fact checkers stepped forward. That was yet another case where they were not able to render an accurate verdict there because they didn't have that information. And we're increasingly sort of acting as if, well, we're always going to have answer to that. But then so many of the things that we tame is disinformation. I mean, certainly vaccines and microchips, there's a right and wrong answer to that. That's a factual question. But we tend to then sort of reach beyond that to all these other pieces there. And it's not just social media. I'll also say the loss of local media. It's a huge deal. It's a famous graph I did a number of years ago showing the plunge towards negativity of American media and actually global media across the world with the rise of the web. Competition, the loss of local media, the fact it could go anywhere, we had to go. So it's not just social media being, we say, oh, well, it's on Twitter and social media. People have to be all exaggerated and extreme. That's what we're seeing in mainstream media, that huge plunge towards negativity, that huge rise towards emotional, fantastical language. These are huge things, and we're consuming all that increasingly on these tiny little cell phones where even the URL scrolls away, so we lose that context. So I'll just kind of leave it with that we tend to oversimplify this and say, hey, the issue here is there's all these falsehoods and we need to build tools to get rid of them. It's so much more complicated than that. And our risk, as we sort of, especially technologists, say, oh, look, it's a simple question. We have the fact checkers, we do this, we define the falsehoods, and we build tools to get rid of that. There's this hugely dangerous space, as we've seen throughout the pandemic, as we're increasingly seeing governments around the world weld these new powers. We really need to step back and kind of think about this, not oversimplify it like technologists do, but actually think about this for real.
Yeah, it's interesting. And the common theme I hear between the two of you is almost the lack of logic. Like we've become so attuned to just doing whatever our phones tell us or believing whatever our phones tell us that the logic sort of evaporates. Chris, I wanted to turn to you now just to talk a little bit about who the different actors are and what their motivations are. And also in line with your research on digital authoritarianism and challenges posed by extremist recruitment and mobilization online, who really stands to gain the most from the use of misinformation and why? And again, you might want to differentiate that between disinformation versus the focus on misinformation.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would just kind of build on your question actually by going to the kind of one of the original quotes you gave at the outset of this conversation was from Maria Ressa, that kind of quote that, without, facts and truths and trust, you don't have democracy. And I think it's worth, before answering the question of like who has an incentive to use kind of misinformation and disinformation, I think it's worth laying out, when we think about democracy and kind of the value of why, we place so much, or why we place so much emphasis on democracy. Part of that is a legitimacy story, right? Like everybody has the vote, everybody kind of gets to participate in democracy, and therefore democracy is kind of legitimate or more legitimate than other forms of government. There's also a counterpoint, or like a kind of a parallel argument in favor of democracy that we all kind of implicitly adhere to, which is that democratic governments are also going to outperform others, because so long as you have a free and open information environment, individuals are going to kind of, if everybody's left to kind of share information with each other, true information eventually gets filtered to the top, and the policies that we, democracies produce will generally be better policies than other regimes around the world. And that's really an argument less about the legitimacy of democracy, more about just the credibility of it as a governing kind of institution. And the challenge there, and the challenge of kind of misinformation and disinformation is there are a lot of actors out there who have a vested interest in undermining the credibility and performance of democratic governments. And so on the one hand, you have domestic actors within a democracy who have a vested interest in trying to leverage misinformation and disinformation to undermine the government power. On the other hand, you also have foreign governments that try to interfere in the information environment of democracies in a way that, again, kind of undermines this notion of the integrity of the information space and kind of democratic deliberation. And so there's kind of two kind of examples that I would give of this. And I want to be mindful of the point that Kalev made earlier that, like stretching the truth, misleading, that's been around in politics forever. And I don't know that we necessarily want to just kind of label everything with a broad brush as disinformation. I think we do want to parse out misinformation and disinformation. So I'll just stick with disinformation. I think a good example of disinformation would be the big lie, right? From a domestic actor that has an incentive to use this kind of information. You saw Steve Bannon and others kind of on the far right, and I did a big kind of research project on this earlier this year. Immediately after the 2020 election in November, they kind of began mobilizing around this notion that the election was stolen. And that happens after a lot of elections. You'll often see kind of claims that maybe there's some fraud or that the election wasn't legitimate. What distinguished what the kind of Bannon wing of the Republican Party kind of did from other forms of kind of allegations of electoral fraud is they continued that narrative even after the legal system had investigated it and concluded that there was no kind of major electoral fraud at all, and that the election was actually one that took place with integrity. So even after the safe harbor deadline of mid-December 2020, when all the kind of attorney generals of the states had verified the election results, Steve Bannon and others were kind of, on radio and on podcasts and on other media out there really pushing this idea that Trump was the rightful victor, that Biden had lost, that there was a lot of fraud that happened. And in that case, they have a very vested interest in doing that, right? They were trying to keep Trump in power. They did not particularly care about the legitimacy of American democracy. They cared much more about kind of maintaining their power at that point in time. And so that's one kind of class of actor that is very drawn to this kind of information tactic. The other is kind of foreign actors. And so we've seen Russia and China very deliberately take advantage of the open access that democracies have to inject misleading narratives. Most notably, like Kalev mentioned, some of the things that Russia did around Ukraine. China's been doing similar around the pandemic, and it's a way of, if you don't have a vested interest in maintaining the legitimacy and credibility of democracy, misinformation and disinformation are really great tactics at your disposal. And so the question for democracies, which maybe we can come back to later in the conversation, is what to do about that and how to begin to push back on it.
Great, thanks, Chris. Kalev, I'd like to talk a little bit about the GDEL project. Could you just elaborate for us what you've learned from it, and what does it tell us about the behaviors of these, information flows globally, and how we can measure, understand, and perhaps stop that flow of misinformation beyond just monitoring it?
Yeah, it's fascinating. So the idea of the GDELT project, which is all open data, just GDELT project.org, and it's essentially a live catalog of global media. We attempt to monitor as much media as we can worldwide. And one of the fascinating things about that is you really see the role of media in society. You see narrative spread across the world. And I did this big report last year for Real Clear Politics, actually looking at kind of the history of censorship in the United States, and then the early web and how censorship kind of came into the web. And one of the really fascinating things that you see in that is kind of America as a whole kind of learning from what happened in the rest of the world, and saying, really, it's a fascinating kind of space. And one of I think the biggest things that we think about, if we try to talk about where does truth come from and who arbitrates truth, and how do we kind of enforce, or what are the penalties for falsehoods? America has this long and fascinating history with grappling with that. And of course, the Supreme Court, I think it was Harlan that famously said, the freedom of speech and what constitutes unacceptable speech is the most intractable problem, as he put it, in the history of the Supreme Court. And these are these fascinating things. And as we look across the world, we and even here within the United States, we kind of forget that the idea of media is being objective. We think today that the news, when we open up a newspaper, its role was to be objective, to tell us the truth, so to speak. And we forget that was a post-World War II invention. Prior to that, we still had the party paper model, and we're still moving back towards the party paper model. And we forget in the 1950s, the New York Times cheered on the anti-gay movement as governments and companies were purging those who were LGBTQ. You had the New York Times running headlines: "Perverts purged," "Government must do more," and this is the New York Times. And so we think about today of, newspapers, they're truth and they're good and they're not, bringing in these other things. No, they actually do reflect the societal zeitgeist of the moment. And this is one of the things that we see in GDEL as we look across the world. What we really see front and center is that the media is far more complex. Financial. Again, I've been a journalist for a number of years, writing from many different outlets. And if you're not a journalist, you also don't realize to what degree economic pressures come in. You're doing a big story about a major corporation. Maybe it's labor issues or racism or sexism or horrible things. And you'll have that, maybe that company's a major advertiser, and you'll get that pushback. Hey, we really don't want this story to run. I've personally gotten emails, went up to my editors that said, hey, we really don't want this story to run because that would be harmful for us. And, we do a lot of advertising in your magazine or your newspaper, and stories get killed all the time. So we don't realize to what degree economic, in some countries, of course, media is more and more owned by oligarchs. And again, sometimes it's state controlled, sometimes state adjacent. And one of the things in GDEL is because we look at global narratives, we're able to see as these narratives kind of evolve and then they abruptly wither and die, to what degree narratives spread, to what degree different topics. Here, you certainly have seen as newspapers have shifted towards the coast, as there's been more of a consolidation, you certainly see less coverage of things like organized labor, or you see a shift towards, labor unions are bad because they raise costs. Because again, if you're a coastal person, well, labor union is bad to you because you're a consumer, versus you saw more in the local papers that are dying, more of a, well, my community is labor. And so you can see all this rich things. And so to me, it's really kind of that societal zeitgeist of media. There is no such thing as, well, here's the source of objective truth, and we head towards this. Even the news media, whether it's whether it's governments or news media or all these other sources, we really realize that the information ecosystem is much more impacted by these factors. And by scooping up, we monitor today 150 languages, soon to be over 400. And we scoop this up from across the world with a real focus on local. And you see this enormous divide between local press all the way up to national press. And you can see ownership shifts as, for example, a wealthy person buys a newspaper. Almost overnight, you can see shifts start occurring in its coverage. And in turn, you can start seeing that impact policy decisions, impact public awareness. I mean, again, if the media is not talking about something, how, we feel that, but we sort of feel isolated. Well, maybe I'm the only one that senses that. So again, that's, I think, one of the greatest things is when you kind of move out of that filter bubble and you look at the media ecosystem as a whole, you really realize, again, how complex this landscape is.
Great, thank you. Chris, turning to you. What are some of the state responses to misinformation, and what does your research show about how authoritarian and illiberal regimes and even democratic ones are embracing misinformation as a new norm?
Thanks. It's a great question, and I would say that there's kind of three when it comes to state responses to how disinformation is being used increasingly by regimes around the world. There's kind of three responses, and the first is just a very simple one of do no harm. And what I mean by that is there's a lot of arguments that as China or Russia or other regimes, or authoritarian regimes increasingly leverage this kind of tactic, that democracies should do the same thing. And I think that would be a grave mistake. I don't think we want to kind of encourage democratic governments to go around playing the disinformation game around the world and trying to fight fire with fire. I don't think that's how we win, because that just further undermines the truth, the legitimacy of truth, and the credibility of truth. And that's not, I think, in the long-term interests of any kind of democratic society. The second thing is to really clean up our own house. And what I mean by that is part of the challenge of responding to rogue actors who leverage disinformation is that we don't actually have a great sense of what's happening in our information ecosystem. We don't have a lot of transparency into the technologies I mentioned earlier, in particular recommendation algorithms on major social media platforms. We don't have a great sense of how information flows through those platforms, or kind of how the most sophisticated information operations are taking place. And that's something where I think we need a lot more work between civil society and the tech industry to get a better understanding of just the scope of the problem and how to move forward with it. And then the third kind of thing, after kind of doing no harm and cleaning the house, is to really begin to push back aggressively. And I think this is where I think we've started to see democratic governments begin to be a little bit more effective over the last year or so. There's still more we can do, but I think an example would be in the lead up to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The Biden administration, I think, to their credit, was pretty masterful about pre-bunking Russian disinformation narratives. Right? They knew what was coming, and they selectively released information in advance that normally they would have held onto as classified, in a bid to effectively inoculate the public to these allegations that Russia was going to make. And I think that was a tremendously effective tactic in winning the war for public support in Europe and North America in particular, because it was clear what Russia was doing, and when they then tried to do it, it fell on deaf ears. In addition to that, there's also just a lot of private information sharing that the government can do about what kind of authoritarian regimes are doing and the disinformation they're peddling. The administrations can share information privately with other government officials around the world. This is something that we're seeing in particular in East Asia in response to some of China's kind of more aggressive information maneuvering. And I think it's been very effective at shoring up kind of public support and support of our allies in both Europe and in East Asia against China. And so I think it's it's not the same as pushing, like fighting fire with fire, where democracies are just using disinformation themselves, but there are a lot of other levers and mechanisms that we can use to win the information competition without resorting to to a cure that's worse than the disease itself. So thankfully, there's a lot we can do to push back.
Just as a really quick wrap up with both of you, and starting with you, Chris, what would you most want to see right now happen in order to put things on the right track?
I would, well, two things. One, I think we need to empower more librarians around, if only in honor of Kalev. I think certainly at a local level, like let's get librarians front and center in our information environment. Then the second would just be to kind of come back to something I've flagged a few times now, which is just greater transparency into the distribution of information online, and better understanding both of how algorithms work and what impact they're having, which will require, I think, more partnerships between civil society and tech platforms. I think that it's hard to know what the right answer is until you know the full scope of the problem and what it is you're dealing with. And I think that's the immediate next step there.
Great. What about you, Kalev?
I mean, I think again, it's local, returning to that trust, returning to, adding context. Again, the tools are there. I mean, the companies with the different, whether it's exploitation imagery, whether it's terrorism imagery, the platforms have built these elaborate digital, signature systems that can say, hey, this image is a variant of this image. They're using it for like copyright, all those things. But what about leveraging those same tools you already deployed for things like adding context and saying, hey, this image, this is actually from the New York Times yesterday. Here's the caption that went with it. No, this isn't this. This is actually what it was. Little steps like that. Those are baby steps. The tooling's all there. The platform, everything exists. It's just that willingness to say, hey, let's do this. I think that would be a huge thing. Again, just adding context and information literacy, I think, would be huge.
Well, let's hope we can do that. Thank you both so much for joining us. This was a fascinating conversation, in part dispiriting and also a little bit hopeful that we can reuse some of this technology. So thank you all for joining us, in particular, Chris and Kalev. Really appreciate it, and have a wonderful day, everybody.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks. Bye
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you for being a part of this episode of Global Insights. To stay connected, deepen your insights, and join our community, visit us at network2020.org.